By the time the Galactic Council stopped arguing over procedure and finally verified the footage, 37,000 human refugees were already dead. The recording had come from a medical frigate with its transponder screaming neutral status on every known band. It showed a convoy broken open in the dark between stars, white-hulled transports tumbling with their sides peeled away, atmosphere freezing into glittering clouds, while children's emergency beacons blinked uselessly through the debris. Escape pods were launching in tight, frightened clusters, and one by one, they were being picked off by precision fire from the warships of the Ver Dominion. Not stray shots, not battlefield confusion. Deliberate, measured, repeated shots, paced like executions. In the council chamber, under chandeliers of living crystal and the banners of 100 species, the Ver ambassador had the nerve to call it a regrettable anti-piracy action. The human ambassador did not raise his voice. He simply asked, "Under which statute of interstellar law do infants qualify as pirates?" And for the first time in 3 centuries, the chamber went completely silent. The convoy had been leaving the frontier world of Carthus Vale, a human colony turned into rubble during a border war that Earth had not started and had spent 8 months trying not to expand. The Ver Dominion had claimed the planet lay in disputed space. The Terran Assembly produced charts older than the Dominion itself. The Council proposed review committees, mediation tribunals, phased withdrawals, and peacekeeping observers. While the diplomats drafted language, Ver raiding groups hit relief depots, orbital elevators, and crop domes with suspicious efficiency. Human civilians fled underground. Hospitals ran out of oxygen. Entire towns burned in vacuum after sabotage teams cracked shelter seals. In the end, Earth did what it always did before it chose violence. It evacuated. The convoy at Nerida Passage carried the old, the wounded, the children, and the last of the civilian administrators who had stayed behind to keep order. Their route had been submitted to the Council. Their manifests had been inspected. Their ships carried neutral markings large enough to be seen from lunar orbit. The Dominion attacked anyway. Worse than the attack was the choice that came after it. Several transports survived the first salvo. Their crews broadcast surrender codes and opened external cargo bays to show they were carrying medicine, hydroponic seed banks, and human civilians packed shoulder to shoulder in low-gravity harness fields. The Ver battle group formed a cordon around them and demanded the convoy power down all drives. The Terran lead ship complied. For 12 minutes, there was nothing but frightened breathing over open channels and the hiss of damaged life support. Then the Ver admiral ordered all surviving transports vented and all pods destroyed. No boarding actions, no inspections, no prisoner intake. Extermination. One human nurse was still transmitting when the bulkhead behind her blew inward. She had a child in each arm and blood floating in spheres around her face. Her last words were not a scream. They were a message to Earth. They crossed the line like a knife. Tell them we stayed kind. There were species in the chamber that had seen suns weaponized. There were empires built on genocide, republics born from slave revolts, and dynasties that kept their peace by threatening extinction every generation. Even they flinched at that line. The Ver ambassador did not. He adjusted the silver loops on his ceremonial sleeves and informed the Council that human narratives were famously theatrical. He suggested the recording had been edited. He suggested the convoy had concealed saboteurs. He suggested that if the Terran Assembly had truly wished to protect those civilians, it would have surrendered Carthus Vale sooner.
He said this while the names of the dead were still arriving in packets from broken transponders. He said it while families on Earth were trying to identify their missing from fragments of telemetry and final biometric pings. He said it because, like half the galaxy, the Ver Dominion had made the same mistake about humanity. They thought restraint was fear. They thought civility was softness. They thought a species that built hospitals on war fronts would hesitate forever. Ambassador Elias Vance of Earth listened without moving. He was an old man by human standards, silver-haired, narrow-shouldered, with the sort of tired face that made alien diplomats think he had already been pushed too far to be dangerous. He waited until the Ver had finished. Then he placed a data crystal on the council dais and said, in a tone so level it felt colder than rage, "The Terran Assembly acknowledges the Dominion's formal statement that the massacre at Nerida Passage was an intentional act of state carried out under military command. We accept your admission." Then he turned to the Speaker of the Council and asked for the names of every official who had delayed the convoy's protection request. No one answered fast enough. Vance gave a thin, almost sorrowful nod and added, "Earth now considers this chamber informed." He left before the speaker could respond.
The human delegation followed him out in complete silence, carrying nothing but the crystal and their dead. For the next 18 hours, the galaxy mistook silence for paralysis. Human news nets shut down their foreign commentary feeds. Terran merchant traffic ceased filing routes. Earth's embassies stopped answering ceremonial channels. Trade brokers noticed first, then shipyards, then military logistics bureaus. The humans had spent 200 years gaining a reputation for practicality rather than dominance. They hauled freight others considered unprofitable. They rebuilt stations after pirate sieges. They standardized docking collars, atmospheric processors, cargo software, and emergency med modules until half the civilized systems were running human-made hardware without really noticing. No one called it power because it looked too much like labor. But when Terran operators stopped responding, lane traffic convulsed. Automated ports reverted to outdated protocols. Fuel arbitration algorithms failed. Long-haul convoys sat dead in queue at relay gates because their human-certified navigation patches had quietly become indispensable. Insurance markets trembled. Frontier colonies started rationing antibiotics. The species that many had dismissed as useful primates had wrapped its hands around the spinal cord of interstellar civilization so gently that no one felt it until those hands let go. The Ver Dominion, drunk on its own certainty, celebrated too early. Their state channels broadcast triumphant edits of the massacre, carefully cropped to frame it as a security victory. Their admirals swore the Terrans would bark, posture, and eventually sue for compensation through the Council. 2 frontier dukes petitioned for authorization to strike deeper into human space before Earth could recover its nerve. The Dominion's Emperor approved partial mobilization and sent 3 additional fleets toward the border. In the Council chamber, nervous middle powers urged de-escalation. Some privately told each other that humanity would surely confine itself to sanctions. After all, the Terran Navy was not the largest in known space. Human territory was compact. Their doctrine was defensive. Their leaders spoke endlessly of law. They buried their rage in procedures and tribunals and black-letter treaties. They had, in the view of wiser and crueler civilizations, all the habits of prey. Then, the Ver Ninth Fleet vanished. It happened while holding formation over the fortress moon of Talar Vos, less than 2 jumps from the massacre site. Orbital telescopes watched the fleet enter standard maintenance rotation at 0314 local. There was traffic on repair channels, jokes between engineering crews, a request from one destroyer for replacement coolant seals, and a complaint from the flagship kitchen about spoiled ration protein. At 0317, all external emissions ceased. Not jammed, not destroyed. Ceased, as though every transmitter had agreed to hold its breath. Internal fusion signatures remained stable. Life support remained active. Weapons remained powered but idle. Patrol craft from the moon approached, docked with 2 cruisers, and found them drifting in perfect formation with no one aboard. The bridges were empty. The barracks were empty. The engine decks were empty. Cups still steamed on command consoles. A card game sat unfinished in a mess hall. One player's hand still fanned across the table. 7,000 VAIR personnel had disappeared from sealed warships without breaching a single hull. There was no blood, no damage, no distress call. Only absence. The Dominion sealed the story, of course, which ensured it spread everywhere. Rumor outran censorship within hours. Some blamed internal sabotage. Some whispered about human teleportation, phased troops, forbidden machine intelligences, or old dark space predators dragged out of myth by Terran science. Then the Fifth Fleet at Irik's anchor vanished the same way. Then a VAIR Naval Academy station. Then an intelligence citadel embedded inside an asteroid whose coordinates were known to fewer than 50 beings in the Empire. Gone. Personnel missing. Systems intact. Every time the same unnerving precision. The galaxy began to understand the shape of the human response. And that shape was worse than open war. Earth was not smashing worlds in grief. Earth was reaching into secure places and removing people so cleanly that reality itself seemed to be aiding them. On the 4th day, Ambassador Vance returned to the council chamber. He stood alone this time. No aides, no guards. He requested speaking time, and was granted it by a speaker who now looked as though sleep had become theoretical. Vance placed another data crystal on the dais. This one contained the full sensor record of Narita passage, reconstructed from convoy black boxes, med frigate telemetry, council routing logs, and VAIR weapons analysis. It proved the massacre beyond all dispute. It also contained a time-stamped notice Earth had transmitted to the Dominion 6 hours after the killings. The notice had been encrypted on military channels and copied to the Council. No one in the chamber had seen it because the VAIR had buried the relay, and the Council bureaucracy had not yet finished validating its receipt. Vance read the notice aloud. Surrender all officers in the chain of command responsible for the massacre. Surrender all officials who obstructed refugee protection. Cease all movement toward human borders. Release surviving civilians taken from Carthus Vale. You have 12 hours. There was a second message appended 12 hours and 3 minutes later, after no surrender came. Protection of refugees is now under Terran sole enforcement. No one asked what that meant. By then, they already knew. The answer came from the dark between stars, where human ships had apparently been hiding in plain sight for years. Relief tenders, hospital barges, survey craft, customs cutters, cargo shells parked in depot graveyards, old colony transports decommissioned on paper, but not in truth. Humanity had spent generations scattering hulls across the lanes under the humble cover of maintenance and aid, each one modular, each one upgradable, each one tied into a strategic web no foreign intelligence service had ever mapped, because no one thought to study the species that fixed things. Under sealed doctrine older than first contact, every civilian evacuation route, every refugee shelter, every relief corridor was paired to a dormant retaliation architecture called sanctuary. Its purpose had not been declared because it had not needed to be. On Earth, the doctrine had been born from centuries of camps, expulsions, sea graves, and trains that did not come back. In Terran military law, a refugee convoy was not a weak target. It was sovereign ground. Attack it, and you were not at war with fleeing civilians. You were standing on human territory with a weapon in your hand. What happened next was not a campaign in the way the galaxy understood campaigns. There were no grand advances, no theatrical declarations, no pounding speeches from bridges lit in patriotic gold. There was only sequence. First, the Dominion lost mobility. Relay gates feeding its frontier commands locked into maintenance mode and refused all non-Terran override strings. Fuel depots blew purge charges at the exact moment Ver fleet tenders docked. Ammunition foundries discovered their smart fuse assemblies had accepted corrupt verification keys months ago from routine human contractors. Military couriers jumped into systems where local beacons had already been rewritten, emerging light minutes off course and helpless. Long-range comms desynchronized. Half the Imperial border was suddenly fighting the mathematics of its own infrastructure. Then came the fleet actions, swift and clinical. Human task groups appeared where physics said they should not. Having used cold mass routes through interstellar dark that Terran navigators had pioneered during the slow decades nobody respected. They struck command ships first, blindfolded escorts with precision interference bursts, and deployed boarding units with terrifying discipline. Not berserkers, not avengers frothing for blood. Professionals, calm voices, timed charges, clear corridors, surrender windows measured in seconds. The Ver learned to fear the quiet before human contact. There was almost no chatter on Terran channels. No taunts, no victory music. Just authentication strings, positional updates, casualty counts, and legal notices. One surviving Dominion captain described it before his later arrest. He said the humans took his flagship in 9 minutes. They cut gravity on 3 decks, vented a forward gunnery section without killing anyone inside, locked down the bridge, and entered through a seam his own engineers insisted had no access tunnel. Their boarding troops were smaller than Ver Marines, slower in open sprint, less physically imposing. He said that stopped mattering the moment they began moving. Every human knew exactly where the next human would be. They shot only those who resisted. They dragged wounded enemies to pressure-safe zones before continuing the assault. They called medics for beings who had tried to kill them moments earlier. He said that was the worst part. If they had come in screaming, he could have hated them. But they moved like people doing a necessary thing they had already accepted would stain them forever. Panic spread through the Dominion faster than the losses. Aristocrats fled their estates. Provincial governors purged staffs and found their own security chiefs gone by morning. Naval families packed emergency vaults and discovered all approved asylum corridors had been closed by neighboring states, terrified of Terran retaliation. Ver propaganda tried to salvage morale by painting humanity as a species driven mad with grief. But the footage betrayed them. Humans were not mad. They were composed. They were documenting everything. Every strike was followed by legal citations and casualty disclosures, transmitted to the Council whether the Council wanted them or not. Earth published names of the dead from Nerida before it published names of the Ver officers it had taken. Memorial first, retribution second. That order changed the mood of the galaxy. This was not frenzy. This was doctrine in motion. Still, the Dominion had one move left. Cornered powers often mistake escalation for leverage, and the Emperor of Ver was no exception. If Terran fleets were dispersed across his territory, seizing commanders and dismantling logistics, then perhaps Earth itself lay exposed. He ordered a retaliatory strike at Sol, not to conquer it, but to wound it badly enough to force negotiation. 3 reserve armadas, hidden near the interior, were redirected through deep jump lanes toward human space, with orders to burn orbital industry and target Luna's shipyards. The Council found out through terrified back channels and finally issued the condemnation it should have spoken at Nerida. It was too late. The fleets had already jumped. For 6 hours, the entire galaxy waited to see whether humanity's cold fury would break at the sight of danger to its home. The Ve armadas never got close enough to see Earth. At the edge of the Sol approaches, where the old maps showed nothing but navigation spars and customs arrays, the void opened. Hundreds of Terran hulls rose from thermal darkness like blades lifted from black water. They had been there the entire time, engines buried, profiles masked under civilian signatures, wrapped around the approach lanes in concentric layers nobody had bothered to look for. Because everybody assumed humans thought home defense meant fortresses and visible fleets. What Earth had built instead was depth. Kill boxes measured in astronomical units, drone clouds hidden in maintenance canisters, orbital tugs that unfolded into missile organs, hospital platforms that rotated open to reveal spinal accelerators running the length of their hulls. The Ver spearheads entered the web and discovered, too late, that every humanitarian object they had once mocked as soft, slow, and expensive had been designed by the same species that built dreadnoughts. The first armada died without firing a coordinated volley. The second tried to scatter and found the escape vectors mined with relativistic shot. The third surrendered when its flagship bridge went dark and came back with a human captain already on the main screen, asking whether they wished to add more names to the memorial. When news of Sol reached the Dominion throne world, something broke that could not be repaired. Governors ceased obeying imperial commands. Client species revolted. Subject worlds shut down. Tax transfers and invited Terran observers to witness local surrenders. Entire sectors chose occupation over loyalty. Because Terran occupation came with rules, medical aid, and an almost unnerving refusal to indulge in reprisals against civilians. The Emperor tried one last broadcast. He denounced humanity as monsters, hiding their true nature behind law and commerce. He accused the Council of cowardice. He promised the Dominion would fight until its last claw closed around an enemy throat. Mid-speech, his palace lighting failed. The transmission cut. When power returned 17 minutes later, the throne was empty, the Imperial Guard disarmed, and every member of the War Cabinet had vanished from a sealed chamber in the center of the most defended city in Ver history. That was the moment the galaxy understood the title history would later give those weeks. Not the refugee war, not the Nerida retaliation, not even the fall of Ver. It became known simply as the disappearance. Council investigators were eventually allowed onto the Dominion capital under Terran escort. They expected to see mass graves, execution chambers, some hidden proof that humanity had answered atrocity with atrocity. They found none. They found a conquered military state being stripped, piece by piece, of its ability to threaten anyone. Orbital weapons were dismantled and catalogued. Prison camps were opened. Stolen colonial archives were returned. Human engineers repaired water networks, even while Terran prosecutors built cases against local officials. The missing, however, remained missing. Admirals, ministers, intelligence chiefs, convoy killers, customs officers who had rerouted refugee protection requests, propagandists who had falsified casualty records, financiers who had armed the border cleanse operations. All gone. The Council demanded disclosure. Earth refused. The Terran Assembly issued only a single statement. Those directly responsible for mass violence against refugees have been removed from all public jurisdictions. They will not be exchanged, negotiated, celebrated, or recovered. Speculation lasted for decades. Some said the humans imprisoned them on dead worlds beyond mapped space. Some said they were kept alive in rotating black sites to testify in archives never meant for public release. Some insisted humanity had executed them all and hidden the evidence out of political convenience. The truth, whatever it was, never emerged. Terran courts sealed the records under the oldest clause in sanctuary doctrine. No statues were allowed, no martyr myths, no rescue operations, no final speeches. The men and women who had ordered children shot in vacuum did not even receive the dignity of becoming symbols. They were simply taken out of history. And history, for the first time, bent around humanity. The Council rewrote interstellar law within a year. Refugee convoys gained full protected sovereign status under what became known as the Narita Articles. Obstruction of humanitarian corridors became a war crime enforceable without unanimous Council approval. Civilian evacuation registries could no longer be buried in committee. Independent censor verification was mandated at every major gate. Species that had once rolled their eyes at human moral language suddenly quoted Terran legal scholars as if they had always admired them. Ambassadors lowered their voices when discussing Earth. Admirals studied Terran logistics manuals like sacred texts. Empires that had treated compassion as weakness now understood it could also be infrastructure, and infrastructure, in human hands, could become a weapon more total than conquest. Years later, when the memorial at Narita Passage was completed, delegations came from every corner of known space. There was no triumph in the structure, no battlefield murals, no captured banners. Just a long ring of polished black stone suspended in vacuum where the convoy had died. Each panel etched with a name, each name lit from within by a soft white pulse timed to a living heartbeat average. Human children walked the ring in silence beside alien diplomats who could not meet their eyes for long. Ambassador Vance, older then and close to death, gave the only speech. He did not talk about vengeance. He did not talk about victory. He spoke about the duty of civilized beings to protect the fleeing. Because once a species decides that the desperate can be slaughtered without consequence, all law becomes costume. Then he placed his hand against the first carved panel and said the words that would haunt every war college in the galaxy. We were kind first. No one forgot what came after that. The surviving worlds of the former Ver Dominion never truly recovered their old arrogance. Their rebuilt schools taught the massacre at Narita and the disappearance in the same lesson. One as crime, the other as consequence. Traders passing Terran checkpoints learned to feel relief rather than resentment. Refugee fleets of any species began requesting human observers on their routes. And pirates who once preyed on the weak suddenly developed moral opinions about humanitarian law. Even now, in outer systems where memory frays and younger races speak too boldly over cheap liquor, there are always elders willing to end the conversation. They lean in. They name the convoy. They name the dead. And then they remind the room what the galaxy learned when it mistook human mercy for impotence. The memorial at Nerida lists 37,000 names, and beneath them, where the Empire's titles should have been, there is only a single line. They were never seen again.